The Orthodox Conundrum is off this week, and we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. In the meantime, enjoy this classic episode from February 27th, 2023, with Rabbi Alex Israel, entitled OTD, Datlash, and the Religious Spectrum, When Orthodox Jews Leave Orthodoxy.
The word mashber, which means sometimes in modern Hebrew, a crisis, but it's also, of course, mashber, it means in Hebrew, the birthing store. And sometimes when people are having a religious crisis, what they're really doing is they're birthing something new. Something's going on with them, and the Judaism they grew up with just doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't work. And they need to create a new Judaism. In fact, that was the way Rav Kook looked at a lot of Chiloniyut. The Chiloniyut had seen the cracks in our Judaism, and it actually was a process of breaking and remaking. And therefore, I think these terms, off the Derech, sometimes even Dati, Datlash, they're not so useful.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. There's a phenomenon in the Orthodox world which is called by various names, though most commonly off the Derech or OTD, and Datlash, short for Dati Leshe'avar, that is, formerly religious. For a community which prides itself on continuity and on passing the tradition from one generation to the next, the idea that people leave Orthodoxy is simultaneously painful and threatening. Why did he or she leave? What didn't work? Why don't they see what we see? Or perhaps, if we're being truly honest with ourselves, what do they see that we may be missing? And when the people who reject an Orthodox way of life are members of our own families, the difficulties are compounded. These questions matter a lot, and that's why I was so anticipating my conversation with Rabbi Alex Israel. And despite my high expectations, he was even better than I had hoped. Rabbi Israel has given a lot of thought to this issue, and his insights are humane, generous, and rooted in Torah. We spoke about whether the terms OTD and Datlash, and even Dati, religious, are helpful or misleading, whether the phenomenon of people moving away from Orthodoxy is becoming more common, how it may be different in Israel and in the United States, whether we should actively try to bring those who have left Orthodoxy back into the Orthodox fold, if an emphasis on dogma is partially to blame, how parents should navigate having a child who is less religious than they are, what we can learn from those who leave Orthodoxy, and more. I'm sure you'll find this as thought-provoking as I did. And we'll get to that conversation momentarily. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Alex Israel is a popular teacher at Yeshivat Eretz HaTzvi and Midreshet Lindenbaum, and an international lecturer and educational consultant. He has a large following on Facebook and records a daily Tanakh podcast following the 929 Tanakh schedule. Born and raised in the UK, Rabbi Israel made Aliyah in 1991 to Yeshivat Har Etzion, where he received smicha from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. He holds degrees from the London School of Economics, the London Institute of Education, and Bar Ilan University. His books, One Kings Torn in Two and Two Kings in a Whirlwind, have been received with great acclaim. His writings may be found at www.alexisrael.org. Rabbi Alex Israel, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation today about what's commonly known by two basic terms, either Datlash, Dati Leshe'avar, which means formerly religious, or OTD, off the Derech, no longer on the religious path. My first question for you today relates to the use of these terms themselves, how appropriate they are, because that implies a sort of binary way of understanding how Jews fit on that religious spectrum, or it denies the possibility of a spectrum. Because the idea of calling people either religious or not religious, I think, is not necessarily fair. There are plenty of Torah observant people who don't believe in God, for example. There are plenty of people who believe in God and have tremendous emunah and bitachon, but aren't necessarily Torah observant. There are people who keep ritual but aren't careful about the bein adam lechavero mitzvot interpersonally. There are other people who are scrupulous about that but don't care about ritual, and everything in between. I just think that calling people this particular term, maybe even calling people Dati for that matter, really is creating categories that are not particularly helpful. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
So you've definitely hit home with that particular point. I also don't really like the term Dati. I generally call myself Shomer Mitzvot. And I have seen the response to that. I have a Chiloni friend who I work with. He's a really wonderful guy and dedicated most of his life to the security of Medina Israel. And he says to me, he doesn't call himself Chiloni, he says to me, Ani Shomer Rov HaMitzvot. I keep most of the mitzvot. He says, I keep all the Bein Adam L'Chabero, I don't work on Shabbat, I live in Eretz Israel. And therefore, I couldn't agree with you more. And sometimes, these labels, they become sort of like, they're like the way we dress, right? Our kids actually sometimes don't like these things because kids are looking for something really genuine, and they sometimes see these religious labels as really phony. I'll tell you something about this particular thing. I went to visit some students at Binghamton University. I was going to give some shiurim, and when I got to Binghamton, there were two students waiting for me. I had taught them in a men's yeshiva here in Israel where I teach. Now, one was short and one was tall. And the short one, looked like just like he did in yeshiva. And the tall one, it looked like he wasn't really wearing a kippah, but he was very tall and I'm not so tall, so I couldn't tell. Anyway, I started talking to them. I said to him, how are you doing? And he says to me, well, Rabbi, now remember, this guy was there to meet me. He really wanted to see me. And he says, hey, Rabbi, he says, well, I'm off the derech. And I said to him, what do you mean off the derech? He goes, yeah, I'm not observant anymore. So I said, well, like, for example, what do you do on Shabbat? So he says, well, Friday night I go to Chabad. He said, I don't daven, but I go to Chabad. And then it turns out in the conversation that he's still got a chavruta from yeshiva, and that he says he really only hangs out with Orthodox Jews. I turned around to him and I said, listen, my friend, you are not off the derech. You are on the derech. You are on your derech. and I said to him something that, I've heard many times, which is that, the word mashber, which means sometimes in modern Hebrew, a crisis, but it's also, of course, mashber, it means in Hebrew, the birthing store. And sometimes when people are having a religious crisis, what they're really doing is they're birthing something new. Something's going on with them, and the Judaism they grew up with just doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't work. And they need to create a new Judaism. In fact, that was the way Rav Kook looked at a lot of Chiloniut. The Chiloniut had seen the cracks in our Judaism, and it actually was a process of breaking and remaking. And therefore, I think these terms, off the derech, sometimes even Dati, Datlash, they're not so useful.
What you said about off the derech, by the way, I wanted to say I really appreciate that. The concept of you're on your derech, even the phrase off the derech, as if there is one way, is by itself a violation of the concept of 70 facets of the Torah, Shivim Panim LaTorah. Rabbi Isra, let me just mention one minor story which brought this home to me. I remember back 20-something years ago when I was learning in yeshiva in Yerushalayim, I took a bus home on Erev Shabbat, and I got on the bus, and I was wearing my frum clothes, my white shirt, my dark pants, and then a woman sat down right next to me dressed very not sanua. And as the bus started moving, I took out my Jerusalem Post, and she took out her Tehillim. And the question is, who's really the Dati one or the off the derech one here? And the answer is, it depends on what you're looking at. So I definitely appreciate what you just said.
I totally agree with you. And I've had similar episodes where somebody who I've assumed is irreligious turns out to tell me stories which I should only be zocher, and just the fact that, they sometimes say that that person is wearing a kippah shkufa, wearing a see-through kippah. You just can't see it, but they're still wearing one. So it's interesting how so I want to relate a little bit to this term Datlash. I think maybe the phrase was coined because people used to always talk about chozer b'she'ila. Now let me explain a little bit for our listeners how that came about. We all know the phrase chozer b'tshuva, that somebody's bal tshuva or chozer b'tshuva, where we mean repentance, that a person has decided to repent from their evil ways. But You know, the Israelis heard this and they heard Choser b'tshuva, that you've come back with all the questions, because a tshuva, like she'ilot and tshuvot, questions and answers, that they identified the idea that religious people have all the answers. So when somebody decided to abandon religion, they called it Choser b'she'ilah, right? That given now you've got questions. So first of all, again, that binary is also not a particularly good one. Uh, I think people who've left a life of religious observance didn't find that Choser b'She'ilah label accurately described them. And when they wanted to self-identify, they couldn't describe themselves as Chiloni. They are a separate subgroup, right? And there's always a joke about how all the Datlashim want their children to be also Datlashim, but their children can't be. They know how to function in a shul. They have all these religious associations. Their Hebrew has all sorts of Talmudic. They're not Chilonim. They're not Choser b'She'ilah because they didn't leave because they had questions. And therefore, I think people have looked for a different definition. But a third definition has come in, which is spoken about more and more. And that is the new phrase, the Retzef Hadati, the religious spectrum. And I think this works in one of two ways. And by the way, there was a show a few years ago, I think maybe even 5 years ago, on Israeli TV, several episodes about the Retzef Hadati, that the Dati world was opening up. So this works in one of two ways. Some people still identify with the Dati world, but they don't keep everything. They don't dress, a woman who doesn't dress sanua, a guy who texts on Shabbat, somebody who lives with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Ironically, I remember working the first time I found this. I worked with somebody and her daughter. You wouldn't have been able to tell from the way she dressed that she was Datia. She texted on Shabbat. She lived with her boyfriend. She still considered herself to be Datia. Now that also shows that Dati is sort of like a sociological label. So there seems to be a broad range of observance in the Dati Le'umi world for sure, and that's embraced by this phrase. But there's something even deeper than that, which maybe I'll relate to, and that is the idea of a retzef, almost the idea of a spectrum, almost as how should I say it, expression of a realistic expression. There's a very, very interesting rabbi, Rav Ido Pechter. I don't know if you've come across him. He wrote a book called Yehadut al Haretzef, and it's about the notion of halacha. And he talks about the idea that this binary of observant and non-observant it's just not relevant. Like you said, you sit next to somebody who isn't dressed religious. She, says to him, Masortiim, the traditional Sephardi community, who frequently, are very makpid about nida, very makpid about hadlakat nerot. They'll kiss the hand of the rabbi, and then they'll go to football on Shabbos afternoon. There is an incredible binary. People who really want religion in their life, and they value religion, and they're committed to religious things, and yet they don't go through the threshold. And suddenly you realize that there isn't a binary. There's a spectrum, and that includes institutions who've embraced this place. So you've got mechinot, which are religious secular mechinot, like Ein Prat, like Beit Israel in Gilo, like Natur in the Golan. You've got Ruth Calderon and Alma and the Chiloni Yeshiva. I heard somebody from the Chiloni Yeshiva from Bina speak recently, and he said, I'm not Chiloni, I'm religious, but I just don't like that religion of the Datiim. And if you want to read more about this, you can read Micha Goodman's book. He's written a book called Chazara Lelo Tshuva. I think it's been translated, I don't remember the English translation, the English name, but he establishes, on the one hand, what he calls the Orthodoxy, right, who reject personal autonomy. On the other hand, the extreme secular Zionists who have said, we want the new Ivri Jew. But he says there are a lot of people who want their Judaism, they just don't want it in a way in which it is prescribed or in which it is controlling, but they really want a relationship and they want to create their Zionism and they want to create their identity around this Judaism. So, just out of this term Datlash, there are all sorts of other definitions, and this takes us into a whole sociological study, not only of the Dati Le'umi community, but of a lot of Israeli society. It's a big, big topic.
I wonder if that concept that you mentioned of Retzef Hadati, that religious spectrum, also takes place even on an individual level. What I mean by that is that all of us at different times of our lives, at different moments, maybe even in the day, are at different points on that spectrum. When I'm working on my business, I'm not necessarily in the same place, even though I like to think that I'm always Dati and I'm always a Torah Jew, and I hope I am. But there are certain intense moments when you're davening on Yom Kippur that might be different than when you're playing baseball or working on your job. And along with that, sometimes that concept of Retzef Hadati might make some people think, well, we are on one end of that spectrum, therefore we have arrived. The other people are on a road more or less getting closer or further away from us. And I think it's important that people on that religious spectrum who consider themselves religious avoid the arrogance of saying, well, we're the ones who've made it, and they're the ones who are on the road towards what we're trying to do. It could be back to that idea of a spectrum. There are different ways that people are reaching God. I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't be Torah Jews, but I also want to avoid judgmentalism.
It's interesting. In the United States, there is, everything was always described denominationally, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. And if I'm not mistaken, in the last Pew study, they found that, first of all, the unaffiliated are the largest group, but they found that there's a whole new group who are not Orthodox, but their most powerful Jewish experiences, or they have come through Chabad. Now, the interesting thing is they're not going to be observant, but their touches with Judaism, whether it was at college or wherever they're living, have been through Chabad, which is, has its own standards and yet is absolutely non-judgmental and allows everybody to come in ba'asher husham. And so this Retzef, this spectrum is a real thing. And I'll say even more than that. You said at different moments of time. I'm finding it really interesting. I'm in my 50s, and I'm finding it interesting to watch some of my friends make all sorts of adjustments in their religious standards. Sometimes the women who covered their hair, who have stopped, or the other way around. Men who are now, maybe finished with the child raising years and now spending more time in Limud Torah and getting into Chassidut and all sorts of. So, this idea that I'm religious, as if it's like this static. I'm in the freezer. I'm static. We're living, breathing human beings, and our experiences in life often rock us, shake us up, and our experiences. So yeah, we're on the move.
Let me ask you about some of the factors that cause people to move along that spectrum. Again, without trying to use the terms Datlash or Dati, there are people who are more observant and less observant of Torah Judaism. There are 613 mitzvot, which we are, as Torah Jews, expected to keep. It's an ol mitzvot, an obligation, a yoke. So, Rabbi Isra, what are some of the factors that you see that cause people to become less observant, or, to put it more stark perhaps, to leave Torah Judaism? And along with that, let me also ask you, do you think that this is becoming more common?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So maybe I'll ask. I'll just say. Recently, I went to a visit to the United States, and I stayed with some friends who, because of COVID-19 and everything, hadn't been to Israel for a long time, and they'd just been back from a 2-week trip in Israel. So I said to them, "You spent 2 weeks in Israel. What did you notice?" And one of the things that was there, leaders in the modern Orthodox world, you couldn't get more salt of the earth, wonderful pillars of modern Orthodoxy in the United States than them. And they said, well, it's really interesting. They said, here in the United States, amongst our friends, there's almost no family where we don't have one child in a family, or more than one, who is becoming more right wing, putting on a black kippah, or becoming a bit more Haredi. And when we go to Israel, we noticed that every one of our friends has at least one child who is less observant. And I found that fascinating, right? And I can't explain it to a certain degree, but when you say, is it more pronounced? That's a really interesting thing that they noticed, that so many of the people they encountered have a child who's sort of on a journey in some way. You asked, like, what causes it. So obviously you can have extreme situations. You can have trauma, religious crisis. I remember when there was that show Srugim, they had an episode about somebody who had, been evacuated or thrown out of Gush Katif, and it threw them into a religious crisis, or people who have a touch with terrorism. So obviously there are traumatic situations of abuse and what have you. But I hope that's not the majority. Let me mention a few things. First of all, I'll say this. For some people, I think maybe Judaism just isn't meaningful enough. I sometimes look at the kids in my area. I live in Gush Etzion, and I see how so many of them are really passionate about serving in the army. But maybe their passion for serving in the army, they look at that and they say, okay, I get what the army gives me, but what is going to Mincha give me? And that's a real contribution, but is Mincha a real contribution, right? Now, one aspect might be that sometimes we judge Judaism too narrowly. And what I mean, like this, we just read last week Parshat Mishpatim. Mishpatim encompass everything from laws of looking after one another to v'rapo yirape, to the health system, to employment, to welfare. In other words, our Judaism should be bituach le'umi, which covers unemployment, and tzahal, and the foreign ministry, which is Kiddush Hashem in international relations, and hospitals, v'rapo yirape, and chesed, the welfare ministry. But where do we always associate Judaism? Shul, with limud Torah, with tzniut, with lashon hara. Actually, that's not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu intended when he spoke about the Tariag mitzvahs. Right? One of the points which actually put Judaism in Misrad HaDatot, the religious ministry and the education ministry, instead of the broad gamut. And then people start saying, well, I don't relate so much to Judaism, but maybe we've described Judaism too narrowly. And in fact, that's exactly something that Rav Kook spoke about when he spoke about that Judaism really encompasses everything. And in almost like a Hasidic view, he saw, just like Hasidut saw sparks of God everywhere, which needed to somehow be raised. He saw, for example, his letter to Betzalel, where he saw art as a part of a nation coming back to health, exercise, the military, agriculture, as a sign of this. One of the thinkers who spoke about this very strongly is Achad Ha'am, where Achad Ha'am, he saw Herzlian Zionism and said, well, you're trying to solve anti-Semitism, but that doesn't interest us Jews from Poland and Russia. We see Judaism as too narrow. Judaism isn't about whether you put your right shoe on first or your left shoe on first, the milk falling into the meat. Open your Tanakh. It's about an army. It's about an economy. It's about a national infrastructure. It's about government. It's about ethics. So I think that might be one thing, that Judaism doesn't have the meaning we want in our world. And let me now give the flip side of that, which is I think some kids actually look at the secular world and they say, you know what, the secular world is really addressing the values we need. Environmentalism, inclusivism, feminism, LGBT, and they look at the religious world on a sociological basis, especially if they're coming from liberal backgrounds, they don't always like it, right? So, for example, I know if I take my yishuv, I live in Alon Shvut, I think there are many kids who have become irreligious. There are not many who have become Haredi. Why aren't they becoming Haredi? Why aren't they all over the show? And the answer is because the Haredi identity for them is a deeply unethical one, I'm afraid to say. They don't serve in the army. They feel they don't contribute to the economy. And that is such an unappealing option that even if the religious mode of Haredi thinking might appeal to them, they're not going to join the Haredi community. So there's a sense of looking at the religious establishment as actually being, usually we say, Torah is where the ethics are. The Chilonim, that's the empty wagon. But actually, they sometimes look at the Chiloni wagon and say, look, they serve in the army. They're contributing to the economy. They believe in equality and inclusivism. And look at the religious community. And the religious community frequently, at least the way it's portrayed by the media, is a turnoff. I'll mention a couple of other things.
Rabbi Isra, can I ask you something before we get there? Because you've said a lot that I really want to make sure I grab onto. Can I just go back to a point you mentioned a couple of minutes ago about the difference between Chutz La'aretz, or at least the United States, and this person you visited's view, and Israel, where he said in his community, everyone has at least one child who becomes more religious or more Haredi or more right-wing, whereas in Israel it's the opposite. To what do you personally attribute that? Do you have any answer to that?
Well, I will say this. In the modern Orthodox community in America, I think things are tough. Even when we grew up, we watched TV. You could actually watch TV. There wasn't It wasn't excessive violence. There wasn't excessive swearing. There wasn't excessive sex. Golda Meir didn't allow the Beatles to come in Israel because she considered them to be decadent. I mean, we're not talking about Rihanna or I don't know, whoever else there is. Secular
They
culture
wore
has got
suits.
secular culture has got, well, in the early days at any rate, secular culture's got more decadent. The secular campus has become a hotbed of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feeling, liberal values in the attack on, maybe even gender, the whole woke or whatever you might call it, the anti-colonialist. A lot of students don't necessarily, they look at the liberal world and they don't say, wait, this is an upstanding world of values. They say, well, this is degenerate. This is leading in a this is a breakdown of society. And therefore, where do they say? They say, well, modern orthodoxy, what the modern world has got so much to offer. And they look at the Haredi world, where, remember, the Haredi world in America, people do work, people, have money, so you can live on a good standard of living, and you can feel that things are more religiously intense. And therefore, on the whole gamut of schools, you do see that. Now, here in Israel, you might say the opposite happens. we first of all preach to our kids that they should be together with the Chilonim because they are our brothers. We send our kids to the army, where maybe they will often meet with, colleagues who they feel are just as principled and idealistic as they. If you become non-observant in Israel, you will still speak Hebrew. You will still likely marry a Jew. You will still know when it's Shabbat. You'll even feel Shabbat in the air. You'll know when the Chagim are. You will have a lot of your Judaism in Israel. And you don't live at a great distance from your communities. You can come back for Shabbat, or you can. So in other words, it's still very accessible to you. So it's a really interesting dynamic here, where with sometimes religious community here in Israel being more of a turnoff, and in America with the situation of sort of like feeling that maybe, the wider world is more threatening.
And I would certainly add something, not to get too much into politics, but I've said for a long time that the mixture of religion and politics in Israel is the worst thing that could possibly happen to Torah and to Torah's reputation and, frankly, to God's reputation. I can't imagine that that's not a factor as well. In the United States, the more right-wing communities are not involved in politics, or at least not in the way that it is in Israel. Obviously, there are Haredi Jews involved in politics, and there are Haredi Jews who are very vocal about their political opinions, and it could be that Haredi Judaism in the United States is becoming far more political than it was in the past. Nevertheless, it has not reached the level that it is in Israel, where there actually are Orthodox political parties that represent that community in government. And therefore, those turnoffs aren't there, whereas in Israel, I'm sure that has to be part of it, where they look at religious political parties, and whatever one thinks about them, it changes the nature of how one thinks about religion.
I'll tell you something that somebody quoted to me that their child said to them, and please don't, I know this is stereotyping, and I know we're not allowed to do such things, but this is a direct quote. Their child turned around to them and said, how do you expect me to have religious role models when, and they were referring to the political parties, when Tzionut Datit are all racist and misogynist, when Shas are all corrupt, and when Yahadut HaTorah are all parasites. Now, I know that's terrible, terrible, but what they were really saying was these three, first of all, three beautiful words, Shas, Yahadut HaTorah, Tzionut Datit, all words that I relate to, but now have become, as you said, politicized, and their worst representatives, right, have sort of like given a bad name to the type of Judaism that they ascribe to. And therefore, you can understand people saying, well, if the public faces of these things, I want to run the other way.
And let me ask you another question. I know I interrupted you, so I want to let you get back, but I have one more question based on what you said about the immersion in Judaism that we have, which is beyond the narrow assumptions of what religiosity is all about. It's not just about going to mincha, but it's about having bituach leumi, having national insurance, and taking care of the poor, and all the other aspects that we see in the wider Israeli world, religious and what's called not religious. Do you think, and the reason I'm asking this is because in a recent episode with Rabbi Pesach Somer about religious crisis, he said, and I agree with this, sometimes in the religious world, we expect that through Torah, a person reaches God. And therefore, if there's something about Torah, or maybe Torah's representatives, that somebody doesn't like, they don't necessarily move on to see God. Do you think that it might be important to reverse that order at times for some people, to allow people to say, look for God, there's God in Judaism, even if you personally don't see it in observance of the Torah, come the other direction? In fact, I'll mention as well, Rabbi Israel, that on my Facebook group about a month ago is Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's at Sal's Yort site, and I put up a quote that was in a book of his where effectively he suggested that people should look for the God of their ancestors, but if they can't find the God of their ancestors, if the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov has no meaning to them, keep looking. Start all over. Forget everything you know about God and try and see what are the deepest values, the things that really, really matter to you, and look for God there. It might mean forgetting everything you know, even if you're a Torah Jew, but you'll find something. And that thing you find is an aspect of the infinite God that is part of Judaism. Do you think that this is something that should be re-emphasized, or is this something which is a non-starter for you?
I think it's very much a starter for me. I think I would very much, look, I don't think that's the solution here. But I would say that, let's say, relating to a child who has, for whatever reason, or an adult, young adult who's decided to abandon observance, I don't think everything's lost. I was once talking to a friend about somebody who was religious, and he said, wait, Avram Avinu, what was his central value that Hashem told him is the Derech Hashem? Well, it is Tzedek u'mishpat, tzedakah u'mishpat. And this person is really, really a warrior for social justice, right? Maybe he's more from than all of us. And I think that's a very, very deep comment, right? And I think so maybe I'll even mention something in this regard. We live in a world, especially a postmodernist world, where one of postmodernism's claims is the classic notion of truth as sort of there isn't a truth out there, and everything is a question of narratives. Now, this throws the emphasis of Judaism, first of all, into number one, emphasis of identity, into meaning, what's meaningful to me. And number two, into the self. I'm not looking for truth out there. I'm looking for truth here. I'll even talk about my generation of when we discovered halachic Judaism. Our parents were sort of frum and belonged to modern Orthodox communities, but then we discovered the Shulchan Aruch. And this was a big thing because now we had an outside standard. And me and my contemporaries all started adopting stricter halachic lines because we saw a Judaism over there and we wanted to be true to that truth. This generation who are growing up today, they're not looking for a Judaism over there. They're saying, Judaism, how do you relate to me? Right? I'm at the center. What's the meaning? They're relating the most important word is authenticity, to be genuine. And now, if Judaism doesn't match me, there's a mismatch. Don't ask how I can come closer to Judaism. Ask how Judaism can come closer to me. Now, this explains, for example, why even in all the religious Zionist yeshivas, Chassidut has come in, because Chassidut brings a sense of the religious into every moment and every small detail of our Judaism, because we're looking for things to have meaning. We're looking for more inner connection, right? And I think that's a very powerful shift, generational shift. And maybe that relates to the fact that people can't just take a package of the Shulchan Aruch and buy into it. And therefore, maybe we need to work harder as educators, as parents. Maybe we need to be more open to allow people to pursue that meaning in all sorts of different avenues within life. And maybe we allow people to sort of discover that meaning within their Judaism and to value it even when they find it outside their Judaism.
Just on that one point, I know that Rav Shagar points out in his discussion, his most primary discussion, Lichot Tzamud La'ayin, it's a discussion about living next to nothingness, about postmodernism. He says that the Kabbalistic Sphira of Tiferet, Sphira that is associated with balance, is also the Sphira associated with truth. balance and truth shouldn't be the same thing, trying to figure out which value takes precedence at any given time. He points out that truth in the world now, based on the Kabbalistic idea, it does work well with the way postmodernists think, is not an absolute. It's a balance of opposites. And he points out as well that truth is a lower value in the pole of values in the Kabbalistic universe than where, so to speak, God exists above in the level of ayin, of what's called the nothingness with a capital N. Anyway, but that's, I think, along those same lines in terms of how people think. I'll let you get back to what you were talking about before I so rudely interrupted you.
No, this is great. I'll just make one last point, which I think might be interesting to our listeners. I find it fascinating, and I think this acceptance, the world we're in with its acceptance of difference, of diversity. I find also reflective in the life of my kids. My kids are very accepting of any friends who are LGBT. They're very accepting of any of their friends who are not Shomer Shabbat. There's a total, happiness and acceptance of different identities living side by side. And whereas sometimes we wanted to be in a chabura of people very much like us, I think part of this generation, this embracing of diversity, you could say there's something very beautiful about this. My interest in Datiim and Chilonim came for me very, very strongly during the Oslo years, and the minute that Sohar, the rabbinic bridge, the window between Datiim and Chilonim, was set up. Immediately after Retzach Rabin, after the Rabin assassination, it was set up in 1996. I was at their founding conference, and I've been associated with them ever since, because I felt this very, very urgent need to bring this bridge over Am Yisrael. And maybe these different identities all sitting in some sort of muddle is there's something powerful about it. There's a show on TV. Well, I don't watch it on TV, I watch it online, but it's Kan 11, the main Israeli broadcasting, and it's called She'ela Tshuva. I don't know if you've ever seen it. What they put together, it's a half an hour show or a 25-minute show, and they put together two people, one who has left religion and one who's become religious. And they sit them together for a conversation. Now, they match people up beautifully. So, for example, they had once where a veteran of the 73 war who had lost his religion in the war and another one who had found his religion in the war. Or they had two women, one who had been a dancer, and she'd been datiya, she'd been religious, and because she was a dancer, she decided she had to become secular because she couldn't express it. And then there was a secular woman who had been a dancer, who became Haredi, she became a Breslova, but she realized as a religious woman, a Haredi woman, she couldn't do without dance, and she set up the first Haredi dance troupe or dance school. And they have them talking a conversation, and they've got so much in common and so much difference. And some of them, there's a little bit of tension, and at others of them, there's just a meeting of minds and an embrace. And, this notion of just being able to live with this difference. And in certain ways, amongst some of my kids, it's just not a big deal. They're like that, we're like this. Sababa.
That really leads me to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the place of, for lack of a better term, kiruv, when it comes to people who've left Orthodoxy or who are along that religious spectrum. Do you think there is a place for religious Jews to actively try to bring back people who would term themselves as Datlash, formerly religious? Because on the one hand, this idea of being non-judgmental, being pluralistic, saying that we accept people as they are, is a wonderful thing. On the other hand, Torah Jews believe that Torah Judaism is the way that God wants us to be. And to say, therefore, I'm going to let them be however they want to be without even trying to convince them of the rightness of Torah for, I'm not sure if that's the right term, but the reality of Torah as the way that Jews should live, maybe that would be wrong not to. So what would you think about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a wonderful book by Rav Eli Ofran. It's called something like L'Nivuchei Hador HaChadash, for the challenges of the new generation. I really recommend it for any educator because he puts together 10 issues which are, at the forefront of the changing world of this generation. And he actually says, first of all, he points out very interestingly, he says that the statistics show that 30 to 40% of the Dati Leumi world, certainly in their 20s, might leave religion, probably 30%. He said, first of all, many of them may come back at a later stage. But he says, second of all, that means that if you have a tension between chinuch, which means giving you a certain way, and the free world that we live in, he says, but that means that 70% have chosen to follow our chinuch. So he says when the Dati Leumi world loves to hit themselves over the back that there are 30% who are defecting, so to speak. He says, well, 70% are staying. And in a world as we live in, that's not a small achievement. So first of all,
That's interesting.
that's an interesting perspective. My experience with Kiruv is it's not clear to me that they want it. I know that I have some very close friends whose daughter stopped keeping Shabbat, and I'm sort of close with the kids and the family, and they asked me to have a conversation with her when she stopped keeping Shabbat. She had no interest whatsoever. She said, like, I'm an adult. I've already served 3 years in the army. I know who I am. I spent 2 years in Midrashah. If I don't want to keep Shabbat, it's for my own reasons, and sort of leave me alone. And I was coming to her very softly. I find that our children expect us to accept their life choices, not to challenge them. And I do think that, if you're talking about Kirov, I think in general, the religious Zionist high schools put a lot of work into this. They try and do a lot of programs to what we might call Kirov. It's interesting that a lot of the people who do find their way back in some way find their way back through a religion which is quite different to their parents' religion. So it might be in a Beit Chabad somewhere in Kathmandu, or it might be through, they grew up in a sort of very rationalistic home and they might find it through Hasidut, or it might be through Chabad, or it's very eclectic. So I think that rabbis do have to come along with a lot of availability and a lot of warmth. I live in Alon Shvut. Our Rav Yossi Sri Ramon, is amazing at it. He's constantly, making himself available to people. I remember once I had a meeting with him. He could only meet with me at 10:30 at night in his study in the shul. And we're in the middle of a meeting. It's 11:15 at night. And there's a knock on the door and it's a teenager. And he walked out of the meeting. He was there for 20 minutes. He said to me, he walked back in. There were 4 of us in the meeting. He said, if a teenager knocks on my door at 11:15, I talk to him for as long as is needed. But you know what I was amazed at? That teenagers knew they could knock on his door at 11:15 at night.
That's right.
And they went looking for him at 11:15 at night. And for people, I know that's a tall order for a rabbi but Mechanchim in Israel, I find it amazing. I mean, I've got a daughter who's 24 years old. She'll still on Shabbos afternoon sometimes go for a walk with her mechanechet, with her, I don't know how you translate that in English, her class homeroom teacher, which she had when she was in 9th and 10th grade. She's still a religious role model for her. And they talk about life and meaning and everything else. And, it's a matter of keeping doors open. And I think that's really
That's amazing.
what I can say.
That's really amazing. It's a beautiful thing. To me, a big part of it, at least from my observation, is that religious role model can remain that religious role model, even if that religious role model wants the person to be a religious Jew, if they don't come with some artifice where they're pretending to be their friend because they have some secret agenda to make them more religious, to bring them along without being open about it. If, on the other hand, that religious role model will say, of course I want you to be a frum Jew, but I also want to talk to you and I can speak to you with respect and friendship without it being about, are you going to put on tefillin tomorrow morning? There are many people out there with whom I disagree about this issue or another issue, but that doesn't mean that every time I talk to them, all I'm really trying to do is to convince them that I'm right. There's such a thing as talking to people because you care about them, even when you disagree. There shouldn't be any hidden secrets or any hidden goal going on there. I think that's a very important part as well.
Right. I would agree with you.
I want to ask about something which we alluded to before, and I also spoke about again in that episode with Rabbi Somer, about dogma. Nowadays we talk about dogma. It seems that, from what I've read, Professor Menachem Kellner talks about this, he's from the University of Haifa, that our emphasis on dogma today is far stronger than it was several hundred years ago, and several hundred years ago is far stronger than it was in the time of Chazal. At least that's what he argues. And nowadays, on the one hand, the 13 principles, for example, those articulated by the Rambam, they've become the assumed standard theology in Orthodox Judaism. On the other hand, people who cannot or will not accept them as expressed by the Rambam, and of course the Rambam's understanding of these 13 principles might be considered somewhat extreme in certain ways, but people who can't accept them might feel disenfranchised. So in other words, the idea of heresy might be pushing people away because they say, well, I can't accept everything that, using this example, the 13 principles assert. Therefore, there's no reason for me to be religious. I've wondered if our emphasis on dogma sometimes might be actually counterproductive. Maybe we should try to reinvigorate the experience of God, the experience of Torah, what I called in my last episode, faith in rather than belief that, to quote Rabbi Norman Lamm Zatzal. Do you think that's possible, that dogma might be, without rejecting dogma, that's not what I mean, but we should perhaps put it a little bit lower on the totem pole of values rather than push it up to the top?
I can only talk from my kids' experience. I didn't find that whole dogma played a particularly central role. I feel like in the religious Zionist yeshivot and midrashot, there's a lot more feeling. There's a lot more, I love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a lot more emphasis on love than yira, a lot more emphasis on opportunities than boundaries. So, to my mind, I don't really see that so much as a factor. Having said that, and I do think that maybe lifestyle choices are far more powerful in this area. But since you've raised it, let me maybe make a couple of comments in this regard. One is the fact that I do think some people are looking for boundaries. I think some kids really do love those 13 principles of faith. They give them an anchor, they give them a mooring, they give them clear boundaries. And, if I related before to a situation in which some people are actually moving to the right, maybe some students actually do want those clear boundaries and they want that. Let me say a couple of things about the Israeli situation, which of course I'm more familiar with. First of all, something happened this week, which we should comment a bit in this regard. There is a religious journalist, Yair Sherki. His father is a Ram in Machon Meir, comes from a religious Zionist family, a Rav Kook family. And he wrote a post this week that he was coming out the closet, and he came out, said, I love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, aval ani gam ohev banim. I also like guys, and I've accepted who I am. I'm going to remain frum. I'm going to remain as religious as before. And I want, I'm 30 years old, and it's enough of being in the closet, and I want this to come out. And the outpouring of love from politicians, from Amcha, from many, many liberal rabbis was, Orthodox liberal rabbis, he had an overwhelming explosion of love, as well within the religious, what we might call the modern Orthodox community. What this tells me is that here in Israel, the boundaries aren't so rigid. I find in a lot of places, there is a war on some of the more Hardali elements against any sort of LGBT identity, but there's also a lot of openness in the more open side of the religious world. If you take the main journal, the main newspaper, Makor Rishon, there's a whole segment of Makor Rishon which is called Motzei Shabbat. It's the culture section. But one of the columnists there, along with Chaim Avon and along with Yemima Mizrahi, is somebody, Yair Agmon, who himself is a Datlash and talks about his escapades as a Datlash. They review books and movies which are far from standards of halacha, and in fact, the Hardalim really hates, out of all of Makor Rishon, they some of them hide away the Motzei Shabbat section because they feel it's sort of decadent, and never mind the restaurant reviews and all of that, and the sports section. So it's interesting that I think there is a lot of openness here, and this applies even to areas of the Yud Gimel Karim. If you take biblical criticism, right, the tolerance for that within Orthodox circles here in Israel is immense, because you've got people going to Bible departments who have already spent 12 years in yeshiva, and somehow they find a way to sort of reconcile their understanding of biblical scholarship along with their frumkeit, and they really are genuinely frum, and yet at the same time somehow find a way to balance that. For example, here, the partnership minyan question. You go South Jerusalem, there are people who go to partnership minyanim, but they still consider themselves, they're not in a separate machaneh, they're not in a separate camp. They're part of the, their brother might be, part of a more right-wing yeshiva, and there's no, Chovevei Torah, YU split that I'm identifying here. Now, you could say there is a split between Har Hamor and Gush and Merkaz, right? Har Hamor and Merkaz, and then but that's already deep in the Torah well. But
Right.
on those sort of like, I think we share a lot in common. So I actually find that in the Israeli scene, the theological boundaries actually, I mean, by my experience, don't play such a huge role. But I'll maybe relate to one thing in Rabbi Eli Ofran's book. Since I mentioned it a couple of times, let me just mention who he is. Rabbi Eli Ofran is the Rav of Kibbutz Yavneh. He also runs a mechina for boys in Kibbutz Beirut Yitzchak called Ruach HaSadeh, a pre-army academy, a religious pre-army academy. He's also a trained psychologist and works in the religious community, with a lot of psychological issues, including sexual abuse and what have you. And if you want another bit of yichus, he's also Yeshayahu Leibovich's grandson. So that's a nice bio for him, and he's just a very insightful. It's worthwhile following on social media and worthwhile reading his book. In his book, he says something really fascinating. He says that the Israeli community is built on the footstool of Rav Kook, and for Rav Kook, and he connects this also to Freud, but I'm not a psychologist, so I won't quite go there. He says for Rav Kook, everything was about harmony. And the worst thing you could have was things sort of without harmony. And he said that maybe in our world, our postmodernist world, we need to embrace the sort of Soloveitchikian model, the dialectic, the acceptance that sometimes certain things are truths which aren't concordant, truths which are both true, but they don't have the harmonious, line between them. And he seemed to feel that this was maybe a sort of Torah that needed to have, more currency in the Israeli scene. And I would argue that, outside the Talmidim of Yeshivat Har Etzion, Rav Soloveitchik isn't well enough known in the broad religious Zionist world. And this sort of aspiration for harmony and for everything fitting in, for everything being, beautiful and is maybe, has its problematic aspects, and maybe not in the area of the Yud Gimel Ikarim, but maybe in a sense of a sensibility that we can live with discord, we can live with the tension, we can live with the dialectic, which Rav Soloveitchik so championed. And for me, as a Talmud of the Gush, is almost like automatic. It's like in my blood. I think for other people, it's very disturbing to have that dissonance. And he was sort of preaching that we need to amplify that more in the Israeli reality.
I think that's so true, Rabbi Israel. Rav Soloveitchik, in his book, The Halachic Mind, when he talks about cognitive pluralism, to me I don't hear many people discussing that aspect of Rav Soloveitchik's thought. They talk about how he dealt with dialectic, but the idea of cognitive pluralism as a positive reality that exists in the world, as opposed to trying to harmonize everything. There can be multiple truths that are all part of the heavenly truth. Rav Sachs put it differently when he said, in heaven there's truth, on earth there are truths. On some level, I think that echoes the concept of cognitive pluralism. And here is a sentence that reflects what Rav Soloveitchik felt about that. This is a quote from the Halachic Mind. The white light of divinity is always refracted through reality's dome of many-colored glass. And this means two things. It means, first of all, that we can only perceive God from the perspective of our physical reality. We can't get out of it and understand what he is in himself. It's always in relationship to our reality. And secondly, relating to this point, there are many different ways of relating to God through that reality that are perhaps even at times contradictory, but they're all true at the same time because they reflect that single white light of divinity refracted through multicolored glass. And I certainly agree. Bringing that in to our world is an absolute necessity the way things are now. I'd like to take it a little bit further and talk about how families who have a child who is no longer religious should navigate it. There are different questions I could ask. Let me give one example. How would a family deal with the fact, in your opinion, that if a child is no longer religious, that child might be creating an avirah, an atmosphere that goes against the family culture? Let's say, for example, that child is no longer keeping Shabbat. On the one hand, parents certainly want that child to know he is loved or she is loved every bit as much as before. That child is 100% a part of the family. That isn't changing. On the other hand, a family has a family culture that they want to preserve for themselves and for their other children. How is that navigated?
Yeah, this is a very difficult, I think, challenging issue. And it's not easy to do at all when one member of the family decides, not to be religious. How exactly do you deal with this? Since we are who we are, I have 4 children who I love like crazy and respect deeply. And they're all in very different places on the religious spectrum, from Dati to less Dati, let's call it that way. Um, and and still very much on a journey, each of them still in flux. And maybe I'm also in flux, right? Let me say that. And I don't want to talk about my children. I hesitate to share any details, but for me, I will definitely say that it's been quite a journey. I sometimes moments of pain, but also a beautiful spiritual, a very beautiful journey for me. And I'll say this: the family I grew up in, my sisters and I, are pretty much in line with my parents. Parents active in the community, modern Orthodox, from also my grandparents. And because we're very, very similar to my parents, somehow I didn't quite expect this curveball of my children being in slightly different places than I. Um, when my daughter decided to go to, I mean, again, let's talk about spectrum. My daughter decided to go to a midrashah, which was like a Sidi midrashah, and I'm like spent 8 years in Yeshivat Har Etzion. It was like, what am I going to do with this? What are we going to talk about? I'm joking.
Talk about off the Derech,
Talk about off the Derech, that, you know. Um, and she loves the Kadosh Baruch Hu very, very deeply. Now, by the way, that was a really stupid assumption of mine that my kids would grow up exactly like me, because I grew up in London in a religious community, but in a broader London. They grew up in a yeshuv. I grew up in Chutz La'aretz. They grew up in Israel. I grew up in the 70s. They grew up in the zeros. I didn't grow up with an intifada and a hitnatkut. What exactly was I thinking? That had emerged just like me? I grew up as third generation British. They grew up as immigrants. So first of all, let's put that on the table, that we have to accept that our children, especially for us Olim, are growing up in a very, very different world than us. And that reflects to all different things, schooling in general. I remember when we got to, what was it, 10th grade in our eldest son's yeshiva high school, and we go to the parents' evening. We're all waiting for the grades and the academic achievements. And the Ram gets up, he says, grades later. He says, you should just understand in the next few months, your kids are going to start becoming madrichim in Bnei Akiva and in Ezra and whatever it is. And you've got to encourage them to be madrichim. It's the best thing for them. Now, you've got to understand, if they become madrichim, it's going to blow their schooling for the next year and a half. And that's great. And we're like, my wife and I, what did you just say? And they're going to drop by 2 or 3 grades, like by 20 percentage points. Don't worry, it's okay. They'll learn more from being madrich. And we're like, is this school? And you know what? He was right. He was 100% right. Not everything is schooling, or remember also, because we have.
I grew up in Boston, where academic achievement is a very, very high value. So that's a surprising statement for someone like me.
So all I'll say is that was the value of a very, very serious academic yeshiva high school. So we come back to the question of having a kid in your family who's decided not to be observant of what you do. What's the effect on the home environment? What's the effect on the other children in the family? What does it do to the fabric of the family? And this is, a real problem. And I can understand how parents who experience this, first of all, I think the first stages, and I've spoken to lots of people about this, you experience a sense of maybe shock, disappointment, blame, guilt. You blame yourselves. What did we do wrong? Am I a good parent? Is it because of me? Is it because where I sent them to school? Is it because of their friends? So first of all, I'm not sure any of that is particularly productive. But it's natural. It's natural that, people go through this because we expected our kids to turn out like us. Now, by the way, I assume that anybody who has kids do something radical, that is the response. But and then of course the question is going to be, how open is the kid? Sometimes kids really are like a bat out of hell, and they are very rebellious. And it's not just a question of whether they're keeping Shabbat, they're smoking, or they're doing drugs, or chas shalom, they've got mental health problems, or they're, in other words, one can't just talk about this in a what's the package, what's going on. If you had a kid who was very respectful, then you can talk to them about it. And let's say the kid doesn't want to keep Shabbat. You also want them to respect the public space and the fact that if you're in our house, what you do when you're by yourself. If you're in our house, is it okay? Because now I think a lot of what I've seen from a lot of my friends' kids who aren't religious, their kids don't want to hurt their parents. And the kids, when they come home, they will take part in Shabbat meals, and they will sing Zmirot, and they want to, because that's what it means to be in our parents' homes. If that is the case, then that's absolutely great. I think the way for parents to deal with it is with a lot of love and acceptance, but also to open a conversation where it needs to be opened. I have to say that, sometimes there are very acrimonious relationships. I was talking to somebody recently, and they told me that their daughter had said to them, "You don't really want me in the family anymore. I don't belong." It turns out that one of the parents says, "You have to wear a skirt at home on Shabbat, and I want you to come to shul." Now, they say, that's the culture of our house. That's our home. Now, what's that doing is that's making that child not want to come home. And the child doesn't come home anymore, certainly not during Shabbat. You have to ask yourself whether that's worth it. I had another family who told me that their son is irreligious, and when he's at home, you wouldn't know he wasn't being Shomer Shabbat. He wears a white shirt and puts on a kippah at the meals. What he does in his own room is his own business. And he turned around to his parents and said to them, "I'm feeling cooped up over Shabbats. We live in a yeshuv, and I'm cooped up, and I'm not really going to come home very much for Shabbos anymore." And they turned around to him and said, "Would it be helpful if we left the car outside the yeshuv and you used our car on Shabbat and went out with friends on Friday night after the meal, or spent Shabbat morning with your friends?" And he was shocked. The kid was shocked that the parents were willing to do that. And they made the calculation that we want our child still to be at our Shabbos table. What's the choice? If he doesn't come over Shabbos, he'll have no Shabbos. But if he's with us, even for a part of Shabbos, he'll have some Shabbos. Now, this is a remarkable shift, which I've seen even in my own. I've lived in Alon Shvut for over 30 years. We don't have cars in Alon Shvut. But when I was first in the Yishuv, there were no cars outside the Yishuv. Now there is an entire parking lot outside the Yishuv, anything between 10 and 15, 20, 30 cars, which are parked there because parents want their kids to be able to, and maybe sometimes their grandchildren, right? Let's say the kids aren't religious, but now their grandchildren sit in a sukkah. The grandchildren can feel Shabbos in their house, and they can they want the whole family together, religious or non-religious. I have a cousin who's not shomer Shabbat. She doesn't live near us, and for years and I love her, and I accept the fact that she's not religiously observant anymore. But once we were at a family simcha, and she made a comment, like she said, I don't get to see the family very much because nobody will invite me for Shabbos because they'll know I'll drive there. And we did invite her once to stay over for Shabbat, but we could see it was her with her kids, and it was too much for them, and it was uncomfortable for them, and they're not used to being in a religious environment. My wife and I had a conversation. I know the halachas pretty well about this, and I even actually heard an interesting story that despite Rav Moshe's tshuva on the matter, Rav Moshe actually said that it's perfectly allowed to invite people for a meal on Shabbats in this situation, and we decided to invite her. And we arranged that she would come and park outside the yeshiva on Shabbat. We'd meet her, and they came for 3 hours for Shabbos lunch, and we played with her kids, and they had a great time with us, and we had a great time with them. I'm not doing it for curative reasons. I'm not thinking that her children are going to become religious. I just want to kasher with her. She's my cousin, right? I just wanted to feel like people care about her. You want me to turn that into mitzvahs? I'll call it b'haftarecha kavocha. I'll call it. I don't know. But you understand what I'm saying? It's just basically derech eretz and decency and all of that. So, having said all of that, it's challenging, right? I have a friend of mine who said that they won't let her daughter and their boyfriend sleep in the same room, even though they share an apartment, because there's the younger daughter, right? And she doesn't want the younger daughter to see her older daughter, who's not married, sharing a room. Now, again, does that become fight, or does that become an agreed upon? So you can try and make rules. The question is how they're responded to, right? The question is how the rules go down, whether the child's open to them or whether they're not open to them.
And what you're paying for them, what the price of any given rule is going to be in the long term.
Now, again, as I say, sometimes you can have very aggressive children who've got very aggressive anti-side to them, and then all the conversations in the world don't work. They say, you don't respect me. Maybe people have made mistakes in the past. My attitude has always been, maybe I've made mistakes, but from this point on, I want to be the best parent I can to my children. I don't know whether I've made mistakes or successes, but whatever I've done, at this moment forth, let me try and be be the best that I can to my children.
It's back to that idea of not being binary. It's not yes or no. There is a huge
Right.
retzef dati in the middle about that.
I told you that there's some parents once asked me to talk to their child and convince them to keep Shabbat. So this child didn't keep Shabbat. And this child started going out with a child, she's a young woman, started going out with somebody completely irreligious. And eventually they decided to get married. And they asked me to do the wedding. And I was the Rav for the wedding. Now, they came along with a lot of demands, mostly to do with the egalitarian side of things. And I really tried to be sympathetic to it and try to find every heter I could because I wanted them to really enjoy their wedding. I wanted them to feel their wedding reflected their values. And when I spoke onto the chuppah, I spoke about how much they'd taught me, how much they taught me about their passion for egalitarianism and their passion for tzedek and their passion for religion to be meaningful to them. Now, they're not religious, but they wanted, if they're going to do a religious ceremony, it better reflect me in some way. And it pained them that their religious ceremony they were going to get married under would not reflect their values. In other words, I respect them. I respect them as human beings. And it made a deep impression. I know not only they told me, not only did they enjoy their chuppah, but their Filoni friends, and most of their friends that were not religious, were bowled over that a rabbi would talk in that way. That a rabbi would say, "You've given me a lesson in tzedek. You've given me a lesson in the meaning of religion." And I wasn't making it up. I was really genuine because they were so passionate. They were a little feisty, but it showed a deep sense of caring. And that's the question: can you see the cup half full? Can you look and say, "Wow, this is reflective of something powerful," and it's a powerful instinct. It's an instinct that Judaism believes in. Maybe it's not manifest in this halacha. I mean, it's one of the things that really I find very difficult. I'm a person who subscribes to feminist values, and the kiddushin is so one way. Kiyakachi shisha. It's very much it's jarring, and I've spoken to plenty of rabbanim about this, and it's sort of difficult. Obviously, I'm completely loyal to the halacha as we have it in the Shulchan Aruch, etc. And yet, I always feel there's a sort of talking about a dissonance. There's a dissonance between my value system and the ceremony. So the question is also like whether you can respect somebody who we spoke about the spectrum. So they're not observant of, they don't put on their tefillin, they don't go to shul, but there's another 70,000 things that you can respect them for. And yalla, let's embrace that. So I think there's something, which is really, really important about that.
That is such a beautiful idea, and I think so important. Rabbi Israel, I want to ask one last question on the topic of families and parents, because even as parents accept their children, even as parents want to be the full loving parents and invite their children in all the ways that you just said, it has to be jarring for some parents to experience that dissonance, that their hopes for their children are dashed on some level, that they were expecting, as you said, their child to follow in their footsteps. And whether that was a good expectation or a misplaced expectation, nevertheless, to see children rejecting what you consider your most deeply held values, the things that matter most to you, can sometimes feel like a personal rejection. So could you give some advice to people who feel rejected? They feel that my child isn't rejecting religion so much as they're rejecting me and the things that I care about. What would you say to a person who feels that way?
So first of all, some of it might be real, some of it might be ego. What would I say? I would say, first of all, find people to talk to. Maybe even go and, spend a few sessions with a therapist. It can be a religious therapist, it can be a non-religious therapist. Have a chance to talk these things out so that things, when you actually do talk about it with your children, it doesn't come out in aggressive or toxic ways. Maybe if you don't like to go to therapists, that you can find enough friends to talk to who are wise and sympathetic and talk these things out. But I definitely do think some people find it easier to write their thoughts. So there are all sorts of ways that a person can process their feelings. I also think it's very important for spouses, to discuss this together. They don't need to agree, but to share how they each feel. Again, I repeat, it can be something very, very, very painful. And you don't need to deny the pain. Rav Aviner once wrote an article about this, and he said, wait, you're not alone. Think about Avram. Avram had Yishmael. Think about Yitzchak and Esav. Yaakov had sons who wanted to kill their brother. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is to say, okay, he's not religious, but Baruch Hashem, he's healthy. He finished his Bagruyot. He has no mental health problems. He's made it through the army. Bariva Shalem. So that's another way. I once said to somebody that I sometimes, when I think about my kids who are in a different religious place than me, we have this concept in Judaism of v'halachta bidrachav. Just like Hashem is merciful, we should be merciful. Just like Hashem plants trees, we should plant trees. So I said, just like Hashem had a lot of hopes for Am Yisrael, and we kept on frustrating him. We kept on sinning. We in the Midbar, and in Eretz Yisrael, and then in Beit Rishon, and then in Beit Sheni, and Lord knows after the emancipation. And look around you, and you know what? Hashem never gives up on us. So, v'halachta bidracham. I'm not going to give up on my kids, and Hashem always treats us in love. And I think this is actually a very deep point, which I thought about over Yom Kippur one year. Because think about Yom Kippur, we all have this experience, right? We go into Yom Kippur and we say we're going to be better and we're going to do tshuva. And a lot of times we find ourselves committing the same mistakes in the next year. You know what Hashem does the next year? He invites us in again to try again. Tshuva. And you know what? I've got a feeling he knows that next year we're going to do the same thing. And he just loves us. He just says that I am going to mikveh Yisrael Hashem. Ma mikveh Matara Tismei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matara Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always there for us with his arms wide open, even though we've disappointed him. We've hurt him. Maybe v'halachta bidracha. Maybe we've got to take company with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I know that's maybe a little audacious theologically, but I really think that our children, even if they reject our way, they want our love. They want our love. I find time and time again that children who've chosen a different way still respect their parents' way. Their parents' way is not for them. And that doesn't mean that they think you're an idiot. That doesn't mean that they say, this doesn't work for me.
I also want to add just one point, which is, I think also, we're back to that resef dati, that spectrum. Someone who decides to become, quote unquote, not religious isn't necessarily, despite what we initially see, rejecting their parents' values. The household can be a household of chesed. The household can be a household of love. The household can be a household where you're told to respect each other. Just because they might reject the idea of tzitzit or tefillin or tzniut or whatever particular value is there, that doesn't mean they're rejecting all of your Torah values, as you said earlier.
Right, and they might be actually, as you say, accepting other values. Two of my boys decided to go to Dati Chiloni Mechinot, and I had sort of wanted them to go to Yeshivat Hesder like I had, and I sort of was a bit disappointed. I thought, they didn't get the same immersive experience in Torah that I had, and instead they went to a Dati Chiloni environment. And then I said to myself, oh my gosh, you know where they got it from? They got it from me. I talk a lot about Dati Chiloni coexistence, but I don't really do it. They took the values I've spoken about their whole lives, and they did it. So
there we go.
What do you want? What do you want? And for both of them, this has been a most wonderful, wonderful growth experience. It's exactly what they needed, and they're not me. I want to tell you an extreme story, but it's true about parenting as well. When I was a kolelnik in yeshiva, I had one of my old chanichim from Bnei Akiva in England came to yeshiva and asked me for a chavruta. So I said, sure, I'll learn with him. Now, I guess my hope somewhere, which I wasn't even aware of, was that he would become sort of a serious yeshiva bacha like me. As the year went by, this guy wasn't becoming serious at all. He was a happy-go-lucky, jokey guy. He loved learning with me, but now, have no fear, this guy is from today. He's even the gab of his community. He made aliyah. He's a perfect balabos. Wonderful. But I found myself at a certain point in the year saying to myself, it's getting angry. Why am I wasting my time with this guy? He's not becoming a heavy, miserable yeshiva bacha like me. And at a certain point, me, I took a hold of myself. I said, are you nuts? You want to make a clone? You want him to be just like you? Let him be him. It's true about our kids as well. Our kids do have our DNA, so we more want them to be, and I think there are philosophers, and Freud certainly has spoken about, this difficulty with having those offspring of ours, have the audacity and chutzpah to actually do things differently than ourselves. Clearly, by the way, Tselem Elokim, in nature, Tselem Elokim, evolution is this sense of diversity, right? It's this sense of divergence. I have a feeling that it's true. It's true also in terms of human experience, because if you take a place like Alon Shvut, where you put about 200 Gushnikim into a yishuv who all wear white shirts on Shabbat and more or less the same kippot, and then you see the range that their kids are, clearly HaKadosh Baruch Hu thinks that, but Tselem Elokim means, like it says in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, that even though he puts everybody in the same mint, they all come out different. They all come out differently. How crazy that is, but that's the reality. And I even think it's the Ratzon Hashem at some level. I will definitely say that. I will just give our listeners one thing to watch when you talk about. There's an amazing show on Israeli TV called Od Nipagesh. Od Nipagesh is a show where you've got various people who have religious secular people who are secular and are looking for let's say their brother became Haredi. They want contact with their Haredi brother. Or you had three mothers whose children had stopped being observant and they had a fight. And they'd actually left, they weren't phoning home, they weren't coming home. And the mothers are literally looking for their children. The second series was unbelievable. I literally spent all 8 episodes in tears, just watching this because it was so emotional. And you see these different people really trying to bridge the gap and to get their relatives to understand that even though they're in a very different place, they should be accepting to them. And one of the most painful moments was there was one guy who had grown up Haredi, had become Chiloni, and he wanted a connection with his sister. And his sister was married to somebody from the Pelag Yerushalmi, the very, 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 very Haredi, and he's not allowed to meet his sister. And eventually he speaks to his brother-in-law, asking his brother-in-law, can I meet my sister? I miss her so much. And this is a guy who's 30 years old, and his sister's 25, or the other way around. And his extremely, Haredi brother-in-law, this was the only failed story where they didn't end up hugging and kissing, and said to him, you know Torah, you know HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you've rejected it. Ein lecha zchut kiyum, you have no right to be alive. If you want to meet your sister, if you're choser b'tshuva, I'll be the first one to welcome you to my house. But until then, ein lecha zchut kiyum. That guy, I can't even tell you on social media how many messages he got. I could see on his Facebook page, right? Thousands of messages from Haredim saying that what that guy did was a chil Hashem, and how can he reject you and not give you a chance to see your sister? And I don't think there's anything more painful than rejection, and especially rejection by a parent. And therefore, I would encourage any parents. Your question was, what should parents do with the pain? We have to find a way to get over it, whether it's through therapy, whether it's through talking to people. We have to try and maximally find, okay, of course, if the child, for whatever reason, is insulting, is abusive, then one doesn't need to put oneself through it. If they're causing trouble for the other kids in the family, I can understand. But even then, there are ways to show your love, maybe outside the home environment, not on Shabbos, etc., etc. Still, I think it's really imperative that people try their hardest and use whatever tools are at our disposal. And we have a lot of, thank God today, therapeutic tools in order to help ourselves be able to come closer to children who are in a place which is very different from our own. And I think they will be better off and we will be better off if we manage to v'heshiv lev avot al banim v'lev banim al avotam, to restore that connection. So I think it's a really, really critical thing to do.
What a beautiful sentiment. And personally, just from this conversation, just from what you said now, I'm taking home that idea of the halachta bidracha, of the ethical obligation to follow in God's ways, means to love people even if they don't do what we expect them to do. And that other point that you made, quoting the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, that we might mint coins and they all come out the same, but God mints coins and they all come out different. And perhaps the difference is, even as they're painful for us, they somehow represent the will of God, the Ratzon Hashem, and being able to accept that and to understand it, even as we don't necessarily like it, can be a way that can help us towards sort of comfort and nechama, I think.
Indeed.
Rabbi Alex Israel, this was so wonderful, and I'm so pleased you came on and spoke about this difficult but very, very important topic, and I hope to have you back on the podcast again soon, because I really was enriched by this. Thank you very much for joining me today.
So, Darabah and B'hatzlacha with all of your wonderful work, bringing discussions to Am Yisrael. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.